Bueno, pues empezamos.
Let's start. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a pleasure for me as the director of Casa to moderate this second panel discussion. It's a session whose title is International Cooperation in Times of Geopolitical Competition in the Indo-Pacific. What's a role for Asia and Europe? Well, I'm here in this session with three panelists who are experts in each one of their fields. We have Pablo, Pareja, Jagannath, Panda, and Helena, Legarda. I'm going to introduce them. But to start, I'd like to thank both CIDOP and the International Menendez Pelayo University for this initiative action, which I believe comes right on time. The Asian and European perspectives about international relations share many points in common, and there is a real convergence in terms of points of view. So that from that point of view, I believe that the debate we had just before the second session, and the one we shall have now, we hope it will shed some light on a discussion that's very relevant in the midst of the 21st century. So allow me to tell you something about Casa. It's a public consortium created more than 20 years ago in 2001, composed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Regional Government of Catalonia, and the City Councils of Madrid and Barcelona. And it allows to deepen the knowledge about Asia and the Pacific region and Spain. And therefore, initiative actions like this one are an inherent part of our mandate, of our DNA. And therefore, it's a great pleasure, as I've said at the beginning, to participate in this discussion and to moderate this panel. Helena Legarda is with us. She is in Berlin, if I'm not mistaken. Right, Helena? She is the main analyst of Mercator's Institute for China Studies. Beforehand, she worked in the delegation of the EU in China. And her professional career and academic career, I'd like to highlight that she had a master's degree in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a Bachelor of Arts in Chinese Studies by the University of Oxford. Jagannath Panda is the director of the Stockholm Center for South Asian and Indo-Pacific Affairs. He is the director of the Europe-Asia Research Cooperation in the Yokosuka Council on Asian Pacific Studies and senior fellow in the Behave Center for Strategic Studies in the Low Countries. His specialty, and he will talk about this, are the relations in terms of security between Europe and Asia. And I'd like to highlight that he has published two books. One about the relations between China and India, published in 2017, another one under the title of China's Path to Power, Party Military and the Politics of the State Transition. Thirdly, Pablo Pareja, who is an associate professor in international relations and vice rector of the Faculty of Law at the University Pompeu Fabra. He graduated in political science and public administration, and he has a postgraduate degree from the London School of Economics and from the Georgetown University in Edmund Wood's School in Foreign Service. In 2010, he published his dissertation, which was quite relevant because it links up nicely with this session, Actors and International Relations, the role of China and Japan in the construction of East Asia's regional order. Fine, so I've already introduced the three panel members. Thank you all for being with us. And just like Ines has done in the previous session, I'd like to start with a context. And what do we understand by the Indo-Pacific? Because it's a change of paradigm. It changes the concept of the area based on new bases. Here I've shown, as I'm telling you, a slide of where does the Asia-Pacific concept reach, which we believe is a much more landish concept, and the Indo-Pacific, which actually puts into contact two great ocean masses, the Indic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, which account for 60% of the world GDP, 2/3 of the global growth, and 3 of the 4 largest economies in the world, beyond the EU and the States, which are Japan, China, and India. Another very relevant piece of data, in 2030, it will host 90% of the world's middle class. And I thought it relevant to show this map, because sometimes we talk about this displacement of the power axis towards the Asian continent. But what's its geographic scope? The new Indo-Pacific concept, as I've said beforehand, well, we put in touch, well, so far it had not been the case, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. And as an example of the growing influence of this area and of the concept of the Indo-Pacific concept, we have had different strategies crop up. The first one is the EU strategy for the Indo-Pacific in 2019. The USA has also developed its own. Within the EU itself, 4 countries have presented their own strategy: Germany, France, Low Countries, and the Czech Republic, and of course, the regional countries. We have a strategy for the Indo-Pacific by ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, and some countries like Japan or South Korea. And it's a concept that's becoming consolidated. In spite of the fact that China, amongst other actors in the area, of course, they do not support it. And its ex-minister, its ex-foreign affairs ministry, Wang Yi, said that this strategy, this concept, is like foam that will just dissolve in the sea. To them, the Indo-Pacific concept, clearly they are well aware that it pivots not on China as an axis for the region, but on India. And this implies a displacement, an intra-Asian displacement of the power axis. So I just wanted to launch this short comment in order to frame the discussion about this new geographic framework. And after that, well, panel members should focus the conversation on that. And with this, I shall conclude. I'd like that when we talk about common interest areas between Europe and Asia, we should focus on these strategies, because they imply an X-ray of how each region, the EU, Asian, or individual countries, how they see the region. So in the case of the EU, there are 7 areas in which we identify the priorities of the 27 member states in the region, like sustainable and inclusive prosperity, a green transition, ocean governance, digital governance and partnerships, digital connectivity, security and defense, and human safety. Very similar to the goals defined by the Asian Outlook. The priorities of ASEAN for the region: maritime cooperation, connectivity, 2030 agenda, and finally economy and other potential cooperation tasks. So in the strategy, we see a convergence, we see some point of union. And given that the question asked to the panel is what's the role for Asia and Europe, we see clearly here that there are convergence points. I'd like to give the floor now, first of all, to Helena. Helena has cooperated with Casa Asia in the past. She's an expert, as I've said beforehand, in the relationships with China. From a European perspective, this is analyzed from a triple-fold dimension, which we know is that China, as a systemic rival, competitor, but also a partner country. So based on these three levels, we could start the conversation. Helena, do you agree? Thank you for being with us, Helena. I'm so happy to see you again. And whenever you want, you have the floor. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Javier. And I'd like to thank the International Menendez Pelayo University and Casa for having invited me to participate in this panel. I'm very sorry not to be able to be there in person, but at least I am glad to be able to participate online.
All the other panelists, if that's okay. And what I want to try to do today is, yes, I will talk a little bit about Europe, about the role of Europe in the Indo-Pacific and the potential for cooperation, but we can't forget about China. And we have, I know that there's been quite a bit of discussion about China and the role of China in the previous panel, but Javier, when you say that there's quite a bit of overlap in interests and therefore potential areas for cooperation between Asia and Europe, that is absolutely correct. If you're looking at the EU and you're looking at ASEAN, for example, or you're looking at the EU and Japan, or South Korea, or other like-minded partners. This is something that is much, much more difficult when it comes to EU-China relations. We see it in every summit between the EU and China. We've seen it during the Sino-German government consultations, which have taken place today. When you look at the press conference, you look at the outcomes of the consultations, you can immediately see that the room for cooperation is shrinking. So I want to talk a little bit first about why I think that is. And the key to that, from my perspective, is precisely the second part of the title of this panel, is geopolitical competition. Is the fact that the Indo-Pacific is becoming one of the main arenas of geopolitical competition in the world, and of course the role of China in driving this dynamic forward is undeniable, even if China is of course not the only factor here. What we are seeing in Beijing in particular is that competition with the United States in particular and the West at large is becoming China's main reference for action, the lens through which Beijing and the Chinese leadership looks at the world increasingly. In the Indo-Pacific specifically, Beijing is incredibly concerned, and this is a long-standing concern for the CCP, for the Chinese Communist Party, that the US may use its presence in the region and its network of partnerships and alliances to contain China's rise. Taiwan, for example, is often described as a potential pawn that Washington may use for this particular purpose. So this concern by Beijing of being contained in the Indo-Pacific through the United States partnerships is very much central to Beijing's view of the Indo-Pacific even as a concept. Yes, one of the concerns, as you said, Javier, is the shift in the sort of the focus of the region, the center of power from China and East Asia a bit more towards the Indian Ocean. The second concern, and equally important from my perspective, is the fact that the Indo-Pacific is seen as an American concept that the US is trying to push onto other actors in the region and around the world, again, with the ultimate objective being to contain China's rise. And the reason this has become so important as a concept and as a perspective in Beijing recently is that while in the past the US was still seen as trying to pursue these goals, Washington and Washington's efforts were deemed to have had quite limited success. Countries in the region didn't want to pick sides. They were maintaining good ties with both China and the US and the West, and the US was failing in Beijing's eyes at building this coalition. This has changed in Beijing's eyes, and the West's so-called, quote-unquote, the West's united response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has played a very important role in reinforcing these fears and these perceptions for Beijing. And the answer for the Chinese leadership and for Xi Jinping himself, as has been made clear at the 20th Party Congress last year, at the National People's Congress this year, is what in Chinese they call 斗争, which translates as to struggle, right? So to be more forceful in the pushback against American efforts to contain China. And this is leading to a much more aggressive or assertive, depending on the area or policy issue we're looking at, Chinese approach in rhetoric and action in the Indo-Pacific. And again, I know some of these issues came up in the previous panel, but we can think about Taiwan and the South China Sea. We can think about China-India relations and the border dispute. We can think about the competition that the two sides are engaged on when it comes to coalition building, in particular across the global south and with emerging economies. Or we can think, for example, about the fact that Beijing is showing increased willingness over the past few years, under Xi Jinping in particular, to pause or even sacrifice cooperation on issues of common interest in service of its geopolitical goals, i.e. in order to compete with the United States. Last year, after US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, Beijing, as we all know, responded with large-scale military exercises, sort of an attempt at training for a potential blockade of Taiwan. That was the military response. The diplomatic response was the suspension of a number of bilateral dialogues with the United States, including on issues like climate change or transnational crime. These are dialogues that have not been restarted yet. Military-to-military communications between the two countries were also suspended, and they haven't been restarted yet either. This increases the risk, of course, of escalation. It also makes cooperation, not just between the US and China, but also between Europe and China, that much more difficult, because there is a filter of geopolitical competition that Beijing applies to a lot of these areas. So where does this leave Europe against this background of tensions, of competition, of greater risk of escalation in the region? As you well said, Javier, Europe, the EU sees China as a competitor, a partner, and a systemic rival. This is a threefold approach that has been in place since 2019, since the EU-China strategic outlook. In Germany, which is where I'm based, it predates the European approach by a few months. This is a take that was introduced in a policy paper presented by the German Federation of Industry. So this threefold approach to China. What we've seen over the last few years, as Beijing has changed its approach towards Europe, towards the US, towards the Indo-Pacific, has become more assertive, more aggressive. We've seen the EU responding by assigning more weight to the systemic rival part of this equation. This doesn't negate the fact that there are still opportunities for cooperation, but it's a reflection of the fact that those are few and far between. And it's becoming harder and harder to find them. If you look at the EU's strategy for the Indo-Pacific, as you also mentioned, Javier, there's of course a lot of overlapping interests with countries in ASEAN, with Japan, with South Korea, and also a clear reflection of the fact that the Indo-Pacific is an increasingly important region, not just globally speaking, but for Europe in particular, for European interests, for European security. We're talking economic interests and trade, supply chains, of course, regional balance of power, but also the rules-based international order. There's been a clear trend in Europe towards paying more attention to the region, because the main challenges to the rules-based international order up until Russia's invasion of Ukraine were seen as stemming from China's behavior in the region and from dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. This adoption by Europe of the concept of Indo-Pacific, this tougher approach to relations with China, is also contributing to Beijing increasingly seeing Europe as effectively an extension of the United States, as part of the quote-unquote West. This is one of the reasons why Beijing, for example, is the first international actor to encourage any discussion about European strategic autonomy. But there's a second part to the sentence. China is in favor of European strategic autonomy as long as it's the correct approach to European strategic autonomy. What China would like to see, of course, is Europe becoming as distant from the US as possible, and the transatlantic alliance weakening. If that happens, some opportunities for cooperation may open up, but as of right now, as I said, it's becoming very difficult because of the geopolitical competition lens. Climate change is often mentioned as one of the areas for potential cooperation with China, and there are absolutely spaces for cooperation in that realm. It is not across the board. If you look at attempts at coming up with concrete outcomes on green transition, on green technology, on decarbonization, there are plenty of barriers, most of them again stemming from the fact that China sees itself as competing with Europe and with the United States. Some of the other areas that often get mentioned as potential areas for cooperation are issues related to food security, for example, which again, theoretically, there are areas of cooperation because there's overlap of interest between China and Europe, but then you look at the reality on the ground, say, for example, in Africa, and very often Beijing and Brussels find themselves at odds when it comes to concrete cooperation. And a third area where there's attempts being made at the moment to drive cooperation, it's on debt restructuring efforts across the global south and in developing economies to prevent debt defaults. So far, there's been very little progress, largely because of Beijing's refusal to write off debt, fundamentally. We'll see. New dialogue mechanisms have been announced today here in Berlin after the Sino-German government consultations. There may be some progress going forward, but the bottom line for me at this particular moment is that Europe clearly has more of an interest in the Indo-Pacific. There is already more cooperation with regional countries, but when it comes to China, that cooperation is very much hindered by the rising tensions in the region and by Beijing's prioritization of geopolitical competition above everything else. And I will leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Gracias, Helena.
Thank you, Helena. Okay, maybe the question should be reformulated under terms, for Asia on the one hand and for Europe on the other. Later on, we will talk more about that.
To address to Jagannath. Jagannath, security so far has not been one of the top priorities in the cooperation between Europe and Asia, but the war in Ukraine has changed everything. This is, as we have seen in the last few months, a common challenge for both Asians and Europeans. The assault by Russia to the European security structure is also an assault to the balance of power in Asia. So what is your view on what is the leeway for cooperation between Asia and Europe in the security field?
Thank you. Let me at the outset thank CDOB and UIMP, INS, and all the organizing groups here. And also compliments to the panelists in the first panel. I think wonderful discussion and good to see also Helena in the background. I think the questions you asked, there are no definite answers to it, but I think we could debate it out in the context that I think there are two critical points we need to discuss. One is that what we call as order, be it global order, be it regional order, what we call it order, I think there has to be more clarity about that because there are country-specific perspectives are there, different perspectives are there are notional perspectives are there, which differs from each other. And then the second most important thing is that I think more than order, we need to talk about what kind of security order, what kind of economic order we are talking about. And then there we could talk about more specific Asia-Europe-centric collaborations. And I think my first point here would be order. I mean, many political scientists, international relations theorists, they have defined order in many ways. But I think the primary contest about order is that how inclusive it is, how exclusive it is. And I think that's the primary contest. If you see the Chinese concept of order, the kind of vision Xi Jinping is talking about, the kind of order India is talking about, the West-led order that US is talking about for some time, each of this perspective contest with each other. And there is no, in fact, from scholastic and from academic point of view, we could define it from different formulations, and probably after end of the day, we might not really agree. But I think the fundamental difference here, at the bottom of the argument, is that how inclusive an order is, how exclusive an order is. And I think most of the points when we were talking about Asia, Asia never had an inclusive order to talk about. And I think that's the fundamental thing we need to talk about, because there are civilizational discourse attached to the Asian concept of order. The Chinese always talked about order from their civilizational point of view. India also talked about order from its own tradition, history, and civilizational discourse. So I think that's the fundamental thing we need to remember while talking about order. But I think here the contesting phenomenon is that when we are talking about Indo-Pacific order, or let's say what I have written about and what I call it Asia plus order, because Indo-Pacific is not entirely minus Asia. Indo-Pacific is an extension of Asia. So for me, it's more of a Asia plus order. And in that context, I think if we try to understand from India's concept of order that India is today talking about, it's again connect with that original concept of Vasundhaiva Kutumbakam. That, we want to, Vasundhaiva Kutumbakam is a mythological civilizational term, conception that India has been talking about, not only under this government, not only under this regime, but also under the previous regimes. And I think there we are talking about that if we are talking about order, it has to be inclusive, it has to be more participatory in nature. Mm-hmm. And it has to be all. All means Asia plus the rest. It has to be in that order. But when it comes to, and in fact, if you see from India's point of view, what Prime Minister Modi and the current government has defined it more as a, Sagar concept. Sagar is a Hindi term, and they have defined it as security and growth for all in the region. Now, this region concept could be contested. It could be Asia Plus region, it could be one of those sub-regions, it could be Indo-Pacific regions, which is more of a spatial concept from Rory Metcalfe's point of view. So it could be a contested thing. But again, the India's vision of order is more inclusive. It's like security and growth for all in the regions. That means what we are talking about is that order plus the sub-units of order, that is the economic component and the security components. And just taking it from what Helena was talking about, the Chinese perception, and I think she is right. And I think if we try to understand from the Chinese vision of order, that is much more narrow, that is much more constructed in terms of China's national narratives, and the way regime wants to define and see it, the Xi Jinping-led or the party-led vision, and therefore. And I think the Chinese talked it all in 2016 in the CICA conference, when Xi Jinping just talked about order in terms of Asia for Asians. So he actually narrowed down in the Chinese vision of order by saying that we don't want to really talk about Asia plus vision or beyond the Asian powers to be in Asia. Mm-hmm. Asia belongs to the Asian. So the Chinese vision of order is much more narrower in the concept. And I think that has been the most contesting part when we're talking about the order. And then let me come to my second point, the security order and the economic order. I think here, in order to have a much more cooperative framework from European point of view with Asian actors or European point of view with the Indo-Pacific actors, I think what we are currently seeing, and this is very much prevalent in European circuit, and you could educate me if I'm wrong, because I'm still new to the European zone, in the Eurozone, and I'm still trying to understand this debate. I think most part of the debate in the European regions today is more about collective security to cooperative security. And that's the fundamental narrative what we are seeing, that on the one hand, Europe wants to build a much more cohesive, unitary kind of formulations by calling it a collective security. That's, NATO and many other military-oriented formulations are talking about. On the other hand, Europe also wants to imbibe to that loose framework of having a cooperative security framework, what it is currently having under European Union. You might disagree with each other, like on the currency formulations, you might not really have a singular currency, but at the same time you belongs from under that broad formulations. And I think that is also being debated in a much grander fashion in the sub-regions of Asia. We are seeing in ASEAN context, we are seeing in South Asia, we are also seeing in the context of Eurasia. And there, Asia has a very, blurred concept of not agreeing with each other. And therefore, at the outset, I said, Asia has a very contested phenomenon of order and security order and economic order. If you see the sub-regions of Asia, they differ entirely from each other. If we talk about Eurasia, which is like Europe plus Asia, or let's say Central Asia plus some parts of Europe, the way the Chinese would like to see, they have a very strange notion of Eurasian order. And there the Chinese are talking about that, okay, Eurasia is a region, does not really conflict, should not conflict with the Southeast Asian regions or South Asian regions or the Indo-Pacific. So the Chinese way of defining the order is very much limited, very much structural, very much linked with their own national interest. Whereas, see, from India's point of view, until recently, if you see, of course, there are mythological and civilizational discourse attached to it, what we called a Vasundhaiva Kutumbakam. Like the original meaning of Vasundhaiva Kutumbakam is that this whole world is one place, and we are a part of this earth, this place, and we welcome all the civilizations to be to be considered as one part of this family or one part of the formulations. But at the same time, what India has also seen today is that, and this is what the current regime in Delhi is trying to define, is that it's India's interest matters because we are the single largest populous country in the world today. We have a much more inclusive population in terms of religion and in terms of ethnicity within the country. Our voices should be heard because we have a model, what's called Indianness model, or the Hindu-ness of the model, what the Chinese actually was defining a decade back. If you see the Chinese formulations, there was in everything the Chinese Communist Party to Hu Jintao era to Xi Jinping's era, they were talking about the Chinese characteristics. And today India has started talking about it. So the Asian visions of perceiving the order to economic order to security order are actually fundamentally different from each other. In fact, coming to Japan also, if you see, the Japan's security conception is also expanding from time to time. Even though Japan was originally a kind of superpower, it had its own narrative, but its own vision has also evolved over the years. The point here, I think, when we're talking about Europe and Asia to have that convergence in terms of order, in terms of economic order, in terms of security order, we need to be realistic to say that we might not really see a complete convergence in that perception, because in terms of definitions, in terms of perceptions will differ. But what we need to see is that we need to probably apply the more practical frameworks which will be the bridging zone in terms of bringing the European people closer to the Asian people. And there I think there are several areas we need to talk about. One area, I think, what EU has done all this while, and this is my understanding, you could correct me, I think before the pandemic, if you see the EU's approach towards the regions, it was a much more China-focused Asia approach. Today, EU is having much more China, beyond China, Asia plus approach, which is the Indo-Pacific approach. So today, EU is looking at much more structural, much more focused engagement with Japan, with ASEAN, with India, and even with medium-ranked, smaller-ranked economies, and that's a welcome sign. Mm-hmm. So in order to do that, I think there are 4 practical issues we need to talk about if we are really talking about the convergence between the European communities and the Asian communities, or the European communities having a much more serious collaboration with the Indo-Pacific communities. One is that we need to debate it out and probably break the barrier on the issues of free trade practices. Because let's accept, I think the trade practices are the day-to-day livings. It's linked with human livings. It links with the economic conditions of the countries and the regions. So I think where Europe really does not agree with Asia or most part of the Indo-Pacific is the free trade practices. If you see, Europe did not agree with China. Europe today, even though with Japan, it's having the comprehensive economic partnership, but it's still not a full-fledged FTA. Europe is still not really having close to even talking about ECFA, forget about FTA with India. So I think when we're talking about majority of the people and their practices, it is the free trade practices between Europe and Asia, Europe and Indo-Pacific communities we need to talk about. The second is the supply chain initiatives that we have been talking about in the post-pandemic world. And I think in here, I think there are many issues within the supply chain we need to really talk about. But one thing that Europe and Asia should agree, and probably there are a huge possibility, I think this agreement will happen, is the issue of transparency. And I think in the supply chain initiative, why the whole logic of supply chain initiatives during the pandemic really came out? It was primarily because the supply chain networks was heavily dependent on China. It was dominated by China, and there was no transparency. There was lack of transparency. In fact, there was questions raised about the supply of the vaccines, how the Chinese were addressing the pandemic. And the whole issue of transparency has been there for last 1 decade. In fact, if you recall, when Xi Jinping actually talked about Ilu in 2013, the One Belt, One Road initiative, and later he revised it to Belt and Road initiatives because there are huge differences between what he was originally proposed as One Belt, One Road and as Belt and Road initiative. Belt and Road initiatives, if you see, this is the map which explains the Belt and Road initiative. It talks about a participatory scheme of things. Originally, the One Belt, One Road initiatives was linked with the China's civilizational discourse. So there is a correlation between what China originally talked and then what China revised. So that's the point I was trying to originally say, that everything is linked with the civilizational discourse and the way the Chinese talk about their power and formulations and security order. So the whole issue actually came out about the transparency. India did not join or accepted to join the Belt and Road Initiative or Ilu primarily because there was no universal mechanisms to participate in this forum. If you recall, India decided to support China on the AIIB formulations. India decided to be a part of China in the New Development Bank to the BRICS establishment when BRICS was proposed in 2007 and 8. But when it comes to the One Belt, One Road or the Belt and Road Initiative, India did not support because Belt and Road Initiative was based on China's unilateral initiatives. It was a national effort of China. Whereas AIIB and BRICS, those were universal frameworks. Those were unilateral or multilateral universal framework. So the fundamental difference from India's point of view was that it was not a universal proposition. And therefore, if you see this map, what the Chinese are trying to link through the 6th corridor is they are trying to link it with the China as the center of the world politics. Next slide, please. So therefore, I think the third thing is that connectivity and the quality infrastructure which would bring Europe and Asia together. In fact, Europe and the Indo-Pacific community together. This is the map I had actually prepared 5-6 years back when I was in Delhi. And this is not an official map. I was a part of the working group of India-Japan specialized group which talked about the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. This map would tell you about what was actually proposed when the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe talked about, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, and Prime Minister Modi, in fact, announced in Mumbai about Asia-Africa Growth Corridor a few years back. But the idea did not really talk about, materialized, because it was a huge concept and there was no, substance attached to it in terms of financial backup. But if you see the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor, they are actually talking about these 4 issues: development and cooperation, quality infrastructure and institutional connectivity, enhancing capabilities and skills, and people-to-people partnerships. So today, when we are talking about Europe and Asia convergence, or Europe coming closer to the Indo-Pacific, we need to focus on these 4 aspects. This PAN idea did not work out because ADP, Africa Development Bank, and Asian Development Bank, these were the 2 main banks which agreed to support, but none of the other international bank actually backed this idea. But if Europe comes to this framework, that we are talking about quality infrastructure, institutional, this will be a boon in terms of, negating the China's Belt and Road initiatives. And I think what today EU is talking about in terms of maritime strategy, in terms of strategic compass, this is actually has been discussed between India and Japan along with the ASEAN communities in length. And I think my idea would be that, this is what I have been trying to pitch in and trying to propose. And I think, last week I was there in Stockholm briefing to the US Congress and EU parliamentarians. They were having the inter-parliamentary legislator dialogue that European Union needs to be factored in this growth corridor. This growth corridor, even though it has not really materialized, there are studies going on. India and Japan, along with African communities and ASEAN communities, they are still discussing how to prepare a much more functional modalities in terms of who is going to finance these projects. And there has to be international banks who could finance this project. So therefore, I think without EU's participation, such a mega deal cannot be successful. So therefore, today when we are talking about EU coming into the Indo-Pacific regions, this would be. The last point is the maritime security. And I think this whole framework is all about maritime security. The future lies in the Indian Ocean regions or the Indo-Pacific regions, what we are increasingly calling it Indo-Pacific regions. And I think there EU needs to show more participatory, approach in terms of engaging with the maritime nations, not only with the big maritime nations like India, Australia, or Japan, including South Korea or ASEAN, but also the medium rank and the smaller Indian Ocean rim. If that is happening, if that will happen, then I think we could talk about much more collaborative ventures between EU and the Asian countries, and that would actually help us to have a much more converging order rather than agreeing on the terms of in its definitional entirety. Thank you.
Gracias, Jagannath. Las intervenciones de Helena y Jagannath.
Thank you, Jagannath. So Helena and Jagannath's speeches have been more related to what we know as hard power, but also in the frame of relations between Europe and Asia, there are also many soft power issues. When it comes to the EU strategies, there are some key areas identified, as I mentioned before, and I would also like to highlight here, before I give the floor to Pablo, the Global Gateway Initiative, which was launched in 2021, which is precisely what it means to do is to strengthen the relation between the European Union and Asian sectors such as digital, energy, transportation. What we wanted to show on this panel, also with Pablo's present intervention, there's the cooperation between Europe and Asia still has a long way to go, because something that Jagannath said, and that we sometimes forget, because the Asian continent seems to be very far away, is that we're part of the same landmass of Eurasia. We can see that clearly on the map. Europe and Asia are part of the same landmass, which creates ties, especially land ties, but also maritime and aerial, which are still waiting to be exploited. Pablo. That's the context, and you have the floor. All right, let's take it away. Good evening. I will be speaking in Spanish because we agreed earlier with Javier that to try and keep the language balance, we'll be speaking in Spanish. First of all, thanks to the Menéndez Pelayo International University, to CIDOP, and to the Asian House for inviting me to participate on this panel, because that allows me to learn and share space with colleagues who have been working on these subject matters. Before I share some ideas with you, who also have a desire to be a bit provocative beyond what Javier was saying, let me start with a confession. I started being an internationalist close to the English school, and then I went through institutional liberalism. I have now reached constructivism, and I am becoming more and more of a radical constructivist. By that I mean I do not aspire to truth. I will be sharing with you some insights on the relations between Asia and Europe, and they merely aspire to, together with many other insights you've heard, help you get a more thorough, more unique vision. Why do I say that? Well, I wanted to start with 3 prior considerations, which will all be affected by this vision of mine about the world. The first one is that when we talk about the Indo-Pacific space, we cannot forget that it's a concept, Indo-Pacific, which is politically charged. It's a constructed concept. And in as much as it is a construct, well, it can't be neutral. It answers to interests which may be as generous as organizing the world differently as it had been organized up until this point. But if you want in its most ambitious vision, we could think that there's a certain aspiration from the EU of widening even more that dilution space that the US came up with, Asia-Pacific. Since they weren't, since they were also included with it, then they needed to cede any power to Asia. Now the EU comes up with the Indo-Pacific region, and now if the Africans or the South Americans also want to join, we'll end up having a concept of the Pacific that nearly encompasses everyone. It's not just a politically charged concept, which is in itself neither a good nor a bad thing, but it's also contested. If we focus our gaze on the European perspective uniquely, Javier was saying it very well earlier, there's a wide-reaching concept of the Indo-Pacific space, but within European member states, a study of the European Council on Foreign Relations identified at least 4 ways of understanding the Indo-Pacific region, from the more restrictive, which is the one belonging to Hungary, which reaches, from India to a little bit more than Southeast Asia, and includes the southern part of Eastern Asia. And then there's the wider reaching that Austria, France, Cyprus also buy into, which pretty much reaches American shores, and that's no coincidence. And then there are sort of positions in the middle, such as the one cited by Denmark or Portugal. And I think that that is important, because in any discussion on the cooperation across the Indo-Pacific region, it's very important to keep that in mind. Second matter, which the previous panel said very well, there's not one India, there's many different Indias. And I think that that was what's said about India can also be said about Europe and Asia. There's not just one Asia, there's multiple Asians, just as there are multiple Europes. There's not a single way to understand the region. The interregionalism studies have tended to simplify in excess these regions, and Europeans are somewhat biased because we feel somewhat integrated or close to one another despite our differences. We tend to project that image on everybody else. However, from someone from Laos, Japan seems very distant, in the same way that for someone living in India, probably someone who lives in an island in the Philippines seems relatively removed from the point of view of the regional identity construction. There's not a single Europe, there's not a single Asia because of diversity, but also because of dynamics. Asia today has little to do with Asia 20 years ago, and probably very little to do with Asia we'll be seeing in the next 20 years. My third prior consideration, and I don't mean to water anyone's coffee by this, but probably it's still early days to be able to judge in a moderate manner what the dynamic and the impact of the strategic initiative of the EU towards the Indo-Pacific space will be. It was driven by Germany, France, and the Netherlands, as Javier explained earlier. They're having a bit of a hard time getting other EU members on board. And it's not just 2 years have passed, but through that time, it has had to live together with other initiatives that have been deployed. We just mentioned one. Japan also launched their own initiative towards the Pacific. China also have their own, and same with other countries. The European initiatives also lives together with national initiatives from the Czech Republic, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. That said, or after these three considerations, Javier was saying, well, if we can go a little bit over these states on the soft agenda or low politics, if we look at three areas, number one, security, above all, maritime security, environmental cooperation and climate change action, and connectivity and technology, in these three areas, there's doubtlessly a lot of margin, a long way to go, which allows us to see with a certain optimism the relations between Europe and Asia. If we think, for instance, when it comes to security, and we bridge the gap of differences between what is being said and what then is done, in everything having to do with protecting exclusive economic zones or the management of fishing resources or humanitarian aid in regions that are affected by maritime conflict, well, here the European Union has cumulative experience, which, if well handled, if shared generously with Asian countries, might allow them a kinder entrance into the Asian space, because it would then not be perceived, as it often is, as some sort of a kind arm, executor arm, or the soft glove that covers that metal arm that could be the US, but rather the EU would come with its own agenda, with its unique agenda that doesn't seem to be subordinated to tensions between the US and China. If we think, for instance, when it comes to environment and climate change, if we keep into account that over the past few years, the US, and this is something that transcends the Trump presidency, decided to play a less central role in international climate change negotiations, which generated a gap or an empty space where not just the EU could play a larger role, but also it can do so because it will not meet resistance from China, who at least, or so they say, is really pushing green energy and different attitudes concerning international regulations for matters pertaining to climate change, which would also allow to overcome what Helena and Javier were saying earlier. When we talk about relations between Europe and Asia, we need to distinguish between relations between Europe and China on the one hand and Europe and everybody else on the other. The third aspect, where there is a good long way to go, is that having to do with connectivity, the digital strategy. Actually, the European Union got started earlier. The strategy is from 2018 and not from 2021. And it's true that the EU has really put all its horses on the development of invisible structures, everything having to do with digital connectivity, and not so much with building tangible infrastructures, which are often more tied to the Belt and Road Initiative. And here, given the role as a consumer, especially in the EU, and the growing weight of some countries, for instance, India, in the digital world, I think there's still a lot of room for cooperation here. I can develop these areas, but as a way to be provocative, I just wanted to, as a closing word, I wanted to say that the EU and Asia, or that the European Unions and Asias are able to take advantage of these spaces or these areas will be depending on several factors. And out of these many factors, I wanted to highlight four. Number one, the EU, but also Asia, to be able to really deepen this cooperation, we'll need to overcome what up until this point has been a very economic-centric vision of one another. Europe tends to see Asia, and especially the Indo-Pacific region, as a space for the development of commercial relations, and it may trade into its strategy. It doesn't have a strategy on top of trade. Their strategy is, above all, fostering and driving trade. And clearly here, the European Union needs to enrich their relation with Asia. And I'm sure Asian countries can also do the opposite. They can start looking at Europe not just as a solid commercial bloc that offers a series of advantages, but also as an actor with its own voice into international relations. The second important matter also has to do with the ability of each side to escape their own successes. Europeans have and have made out of the European Union, we made our stronghold of, our international stronghold out of the European Union. In Asia, we tend to look towards ASEAN. But to make that cooperation move forward, we probably must transcend the discussion between the two most important regional blocs. We have to be a bit more creative. We need to think of new formats. If these are new scenarios, we must think of a new way to relate to one another where we're not anchored in a classical multilateralism. We need to understand what Asian countries want, not just what matters they want to talk about, but in what way do they want to talk about these things? In what kind of organizations or forums or spaces do they feel comfortable to make sure that this cooperation is possible? There's a third matter, and it has to do with something we all talked about, which is the need to escape the temptation to subsume all of Asia to China, and what I was saying we must avoid just a moment ago, to make two blocks, just to not fall into that trap, relations with China and relation with everyone else. To everyone else, that's deeply offensive. But it's not just offensive. It's also not profitable at all. Jagannath was saying it earlier. We know so much less about India than we know about China, but the sheer magnitude of India as a country is keeping us from understanding and reaching the country in the same way we do with a country like Cambodia. But if we want to cooperate with these countries, we must stop grouping them together, which is something we find really hard to do. Our greatest sin here is the same one that we accuse Beijing of. We tell Beijing that from the Beijing Tower in China, they look at all European as little peoples united in the same blocks. But yet when we look to Asia, at most we set China, India and Japan apart for various reasons. But every other country, basically, we put in the same bag. And my fourth and last challenge that I think we need to face is that in order to truly cooperate with Asia, both parties must probably make a more active effort to not show so much that in that attempt at cooperation, we're trying to escape the influx of the US and China. We must neither fall into the trap of doing everything based on what they want, nor do we have to pretend that they don't exist. We probably need to bring them into the equation, but in a different way than we have done up until this point. If we look at the study that the European Council of Foreign Relations was mentioning, it's very interesting because whether it be because of the positive influence or the negative space it generates, nearly all European public opinions tend to regard their role in the Indo-Pacific region based on the relation that their country has with the US. And based off up until what point does that upset the strategy with the US? Until we are incapable to overcome that historic dynamic and put it in its rightful place, it will be really difficult for us to cooperate. I'm going to stop here because I wanted to respect time and be a bit provocative, but we can talk about that later. That's great, Pablo. So I would go back to that last point to launch a question to our three panelists. And we can start with you, Helena, if that's all right with you. What I'm sensing is that on the one hand, in that geopolitical competition between China and the US, Asian countries don't want to pick a side. And on the other hand, the European Union is trying to consolidate their strategic autonomy. So there's a convergence of visions right there on that basis. Do you think that we could create a third way, a bloc that without being fully aligned with either the positions of the US or China can regard international relations from a point of view that it's more and more cohesive? Or is that just wishful thinking? Still, what I do think is that there's a minimum foundation for cooperation to remove ourselves from that rivalry between the US and China. What is the margin there for us to work together in that region, Europe and Asia?
I'll stick with English to keep the linguistic balance. That's a great question, and I have an answer that I think partly some people will disagree with. I'm not as constructivist as Pablo is. I agree. Countries in ASEAN, in most of the Indo-Pacific, don't want to take sides. Same in Europe. That applies to other regions of the world. You think Africa, you think Latin America, you think the Middle East. Generally speaking, nobody wants to take sides. They want to maintain relations with both China and the United States, hedge against each other, find the best opportunities for their own sort of national interest and priorities, which makes absolutely perfect sense. It's a position that's extremely logical. The reality, however, and this is a reality that many of these countries are starting to confront, and that you hear coming out of many countries in Southeast Asia at the moment, is the fact that regardless of whether they want to pick sides or not, two things. One, the blocs don't really exist. We're not in a Cold War situation. We don't have a China bloc that's completely separate from a US bloc. So it's very difficult to speak about trying to build a third bloc that will be in the middle. The reality, as I said, is that most countries, depending on the issue, depending on which type of order we're looking at, or which type of sort of multilateral engagement, which policy issue, will align with one or with the other or with neither. So creating another bloc is not real. But the second point that I want to make here is that, like it or not, you cannot escape US-China competition. You cannot escape tension dynamics. And if a conflict does break out, sides will have to be picked, like it or not. And yes, that is not in ASEAN's interest, that is not in Europe's interest, but it's the reality we're living with. If a conflict breaks out over Taiwan tomorrow or in the South China Sea, most countries in the region are very aware of the fact, and again, you hear them say this constantly, they will be facing that choice. So what, from my perspective, we need to do as Europe, as countries in the Indo-Pacific or in Asia that do not want to pick sides, it's we need to try and do something to manage that competition. We need to try and prevent that competition from escalating best as we can. It is that geopolitical competition that will shape the choices of most countries, including in Europe. And I don't think that's something that we can ignore.
Well, I think this is an interesting question in the sense that I don't think it would be entirely possible to, keep away everything from China, or still expect that China will follow the same rules of the games and China will be the same power what the West once expected. I think it is very premature to say that we could do it without China or with China. I think what we could do here is that learning from the history, how and where the US-China competition has give us rooms for thought and possibly for alternative thought. If you take the example of China, the way the Chinese established the alternative institution, what they called institutions beyond the Bretton Woods institutions, and the primary aim behind the Chinese institutions were, or the China-driven institutions were, that they didn't like US dominating the institutions. So therefore, the Chinese proposed a lot of other institutions which they could be the drivers, they could dominate those forums. For example, if we talk about AIIB, I mean, AIIB might be a multilateral framework among China, India, Russia, many other countries, but primarily it was a China-driven proposition. But within AIIB, the biggest learning lesson we learn is that there are so many European countries that are members of AIIB. So today what we have seen, those European countries, while being with the Bretton Woods institutions, they have also decided to be with China in the Chinese orchestrated institutions or frameworks. So therefore, there is not entirely a case of either and or. And particularly, I think we have to agree with the notion that many small countries, medium-ranked countries, they will find their way out to navigate their national interest within that US-China competition. So I think US-China competition, I would agree with the earlier view, what Helena was saying, is inevitable to be there. It is only going to intensify, but also what we have to think is that there is many countries, they will find a way out to survive in this competition. We don't have to build another framework, another world, and this is what I think many countries today are realizing, including Japan, South Korea. If you study the Japanese foreign policy, Korean foreign policy, including Indian foreign policy, we are believing in much more small group of nations collaborating with each other, what we call minilateralisms. We don't need another alternative world or another alternative structure to say, beyond the US-led structure or the China-led structure, but what we need is much more serious practical collaboration that minilaterals or trilateralisms are talking about.
Well, in order to give food for thought and to be controversial, I am not sure I am against what you have just said. To a large extent, I agree with what you have said, but I believe there is another way of looking at things. We could also think that a large part of the Asian countries that do not have a specifically high global weight, for the past 70 years, they have tried to become emancipated from a certain way of understanding the world. They have tried to free themselves from that certain way of understanding the world. And that emancipation can be seen in a realistic way in international relations as a way of distancing themselves from the USA or from China, or to avoid the hegemony of the USA or of China, or to a larger extent as an attempt to escape the castrating effect of the discourse of the competition between the US and China. That doesn't mean that there is no competition between China and the US. It does exist. But it doesn't need to be the dominating narrative. It doesn't need to be the framework in which we interpret everything. And here, the EU could actually, I'm not saying that would be the best, but it could actually explore a more courageous approach, i.e. to bet on a discourse that does not oppose either the USA or China, but it wants its relations to be framed in the discursive framework that allows everything to be interpreted. And I believe that in some Asian countries, this would actually be welcome. Not because it forces them to side on with one or the other. I mean, probably most Asian countries will try to navigate these uncharted waters because their level of interpenetration by one economy or the other is so large that right now, practically no Asian country can actually do away with one or the other. Most of them are highly, highly linked with both of them. I could almost say the same thing about the USA and China. I mean, they can get mad at each other, but I mean, let's see where their madness comes, because their level of dependency is shown with their almost failed attempt to get rid one from the other. But I believe that here there is leeway for the EU, going back to the question asked by Javier, for the EU to explore with a little bit of creativity this space. I mean, my impression, I may be wrong, but my impression is that the EU has a possibility for things to go well for it if it's ready to assume the risk of exploring new concepts, new formats, and new strategies. Or it will be condemned, it will be doomed to losing its relevance if it limits itself to reproduce what it has always done, and which it does so well. And here we need to choose between comfort and the possibility that things come out well. I always claim that we should have the right to make mistakes. And I would ask the EU to be more ambitious, not more ambitious in terms of its interests, but more ambitious in terms of its capability to promote, and I link this up with what was mentioned during the first panel discussion, a change in the rules and order principles, not from the point of view of insatisfaction, but from the conviction that by changing them, by altering them, you can do things better. And this, if it's well explained, should not confront it directly with the USA. And it could actually be affected, it could be welcomed by these other countries. I know it sounds naive, but it has a lot of ambition as a project. I mean, it's not a superficial answer of not upsetting one or the other. It will upset many people. It is part of the EU's call. Thank you.
Point here, I think what we have to see, if we are talking about really establishing a third way of, addressing the global governance issues,
yes.
I think we have to also learn one more thing from the pandemic, that what we saw, neither US or the West nor China were able to address those governance related issues during the pandemic.
Yes.
So I think taking the lessons from there, I am not yet sure whether if we are proposing a third way of addressing such issues, who will provide leadership to that third way? Is it going to be a cooperative leadership or a shared leadership or a much more collective leadership? I think once we have a clarity about that, then probably we could talk about a third way. But without having clarity about who is going to provide the leadership, how the governance issues are going to be addressed, we should not be really talking about the third way. I think world is very much divided already, and having a third way would only further add to that division.
Thank you, Jagannath. Tenemos 15 minutos para preguntas.
We have 15 minutes for questions, both from the audience, in person and online. Those who follow us through the social media can ask through the chat box. Or does anybody from the audience here in person has any questions for the panel members? Well, thank you.
For all the panelists today. I think it was a very interesting and profound discussion that was done today. And I wanted to address a question to Mr. Jagannath. When you were talking about the AAGC initiative carried by the India, Asia, India, and the Pacific, we're talking about the lack of the EU presence in that initiative. But then the Global Gateway appeared, and the Global Gateway stands as a sort of means to be the opposite of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. So in that sense, I would like to know how mainly India views this initiative in contrast to what was already being trying to apply in real life.
I have a question. Oh, thank you. have a question for Pablo. I found what you said very interesting about more creative ways to look at Asia and Asia to look at Europe. And I'm wondering, I'm new to the world of sort of European foreign policy or external action or however it's defined. And Europe is going through its own transition vis-a-vis its own region, right? So I'm looking at sort of Germany, and Germany's had a historical sort of foreign policy strategy, which is sort of economic relations with China, energy dependency on Russia, and all of that is changing after the war in Ukraine. And I'm wondering that because Europe is going through so much of its own sort of redefinitions, is a wiser way of kind of creative thinking vis-a-vis Asia sort of more individual, like bilateral? So like France and India, France and Asia, Germany. Because I'm wondering, as a unanimous Europe, it's quite challenging to think so creatively when so much is going on from a security perspective. And I'm wondering if a more sort of do you think this would fragment the approach? Do you think or do you think it can actually work, where you have a sort of fragmented but sort of central approach to thinking creatively? Thank you.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Si no.
Any further questions, please? Any further questions?
Global gateway thing, and I think if we talk about the global gateway, that's an interesting connectivity framework that the EU has talked about for the last couple of years. I think all the right words are used in that framework. But when it comes to implementing, I think there are practical issues that EU would be facing. But as far as India is concerned, I think officially and unofficially, India has more or less seen that global gateway initiative as a positive development and has welcomed it. And recently you just saw, I think just 2-3 weeks back, there was this first global gateway conference happened in the Shillong, I think northeastern region of India. So I think that's a positive thing as far as engagement between EU, India, when it comes to connectivity and infrastructure development is concerned. But I think there are critical areas of convergence and divergences are also there that we should be mindful about. When we are talking about connectivity and infrastructure development, of course, there has to be a sustainable way of going about the things. But at the same time, what we need to be really clear about is that I think there is too much stress about qualitative infrastructure and qualitative connectivity approaches. And I think that's the differencing point, because a populous country like India, which believes in the market economies, in terms of fighting with the lands and the landlords there, it's not always really possible to bring out the highest quality of infrastructure. So what we are talking about, quality infrastructure or qualitative infrastructure, I think there has to be much more consensus based or a kind of a more consensual agreement between EU and India. That will be only adding to the value of India-EU relationship, and global gateways should not really only talk about quality infrastructure development. The second is that value-driven. I mean, what we call as a value-driven initiatives in EU's approach could be also contested in India's context. Because let's understand, India domestically is a multi-religious, multi-ethnic society. What we call a kind of a national value could also differ from the regional values within India. So I think when it comes to practical implementation of infrastructure and connectivity issues within India, we need to also talk about local conditions, which are much more value-centric. So value is not a universal concept if we try to understand from a local point of view. Local point of view, I mean, there is this concept that everything local today is global. So I think that has to be the trademark for value-driven initiatives when we're talking about quality infrastructure, connectivities and all. Then there are issues like multimodal connectivity between EU and India. And global gateway initiatives are also talking about that. But within that, there are many issues like science and technology, digital connectivities, which are not necessarily India and EU are going to find complementarities always. There are many countries within Europe, they might agree with India because there are countries like rising economies within within EU, or lesser developed economies within EU which might agree with India. But when it comes to developed economies like Germany or let's say Sweden or Netherlands, or let's say Denmark, Norway, they might not really agree, and that has been the contesting point. So I think Global Gateway in its entirety has been welcomed, officially welcomed, unofficially welcomed, and I think there has been a talk and a lot of discussion is going on. But to implement it within India as a kind of a real key arc note between EU and India would be really difficult on every aspect. But yes, when it comes to road infrastructure, railway infrastructure, some of the digital connectivity issues, I think there are complementarities which are emerging, and EU would only emerge as a bigger actor in India's domestic market.
Well, thank you very much for the question. I found it very interesting, and I do agree with you that the European Union is currently undergoing a redefinition, which makes it a bit harder for the European Union to find its way to develop its strategy. And let me share with you two thoughts that came to my mind while you were asking your question. One is that, and that's what made your question particularly relevant to me, which is that I think that one of the ways in which the European Union could engage better with Asia is if it were capable of leaving behind the old distinction between a bilateral approach and a multilateral approach. Multilateralism and bilateralism in Europe have traditionally been perceived as being mutually exclusive and weakening each other. The Asian experience has proven that Asian countries are very selective. Sometimes they resort to bilateralism, some others they engage with multilateral initiatives, and it is not because they are unable or because they lack the resources, it's because they strategically find it more appealing, because it's more consistent with their own idiosyncrasies or their singularities or their traditions. So I think that the Europeans would do a good job if they were willing to explore the leverage or the possibilities that a combined strategy between multilateralism and bilateralism could offer the European Union. Having said that, and so that I contradict myself, which is what I like the most, I think that the European Union also has a possibility to develop a joint strategy, a more multilateral strategy, in spite of the recent weaknesses. And not only learning from the experiences of Ukraine or Libya or recent situations, but also I think the European Union, and again, has a possibility to come up with something slightly different. I mean, we've seen it in the past that the European Union strategy towards certain regions was initially consistent or respectful to the particular interest of those countries who had historical traditional relations with these areas. Being the case, for example, Spain and Portugal influencing the European Union's approach towards Latin America, France informing most of the European Union strategy towards certain regions. In the case of the Indo-Pacific, they very much mimicked the same experience. It's France, Germany, and the Netherlands influencing this strategy, which are the countries that, leaving the UK aside, because of obvious reasons, have more vested interests. And I'm not advocating for a minimum common denominator sort of policy. I think it would be a mistake for the European Union to try to combine all the different interests and then present a viable foreign policy. But I think that if the European Union were willing to do a more provocative, groundbreaking exercise, saying, okay, let's try to think of all the different common concerns that we have with Asia in general. And here climate change, transnational challenges, the digital divide are problems of common concern. And luckily or unfortunately for the European Union, there is not a very strong dependency between Asian countries and Europe in these particular areas. I mean, they are very much connected, but they are not dependent on the resources. So they could explore possibilities that would not send the image that, oh, you're hiding your actual interest. This is a Trojan horse. You're coming here with this offer, but deep inside what you have in mind is something different. So I think that trying to be a bit more constructive, not constructivist, but a bit more constructive, I think that the European Union would do a good job by combining bilateral and multilateral initiatives while at the same time promoting a more original, and let me use that word, more original and mutually constructed relationship with Asia. And I think, for instance, this is a perfect occasion for the European Union to actually engage Asian countries in the definition of its own strategy, which is basically the reverse of what you were suggesting before for the Japan-India situation, which is like engage them in the formulation of your strategy, and maybe there is more space for you to actually do something. Otherwise, they're going to see this like, oh, so here you come with an offer that you haven't even asked me what did I want for lunch, and here you come with a menu that it's very nice, but I haven't had a say on the dishes. I was not asked about what I'm allergic to. So maybe you get it right, but there is a possibility that you get it even righter if you ask me first. No, thanks for the question.
Helena, no sé si tienes algo que añadir a los comentarios.
Helena, do you have any comments? Would you like to react to Pablo's comments or Jagannath's comments?
I guess both the issue of global gateway and the EU's approach to Asia or the Indo-Pacific, leaving aside the complicating factor, which is EU internal politics and the different layers of competence that we're playing with between member states and the Commission, which of course makes this a much murkier picture. I agree with Pablo that there's plenty of space, in theory, at least on paper, for the EU, for Europe to play a much more constructive role in the region. There's space for cooperation, there's plenty that can be done. Some of the areas have been mentioned, loads of issues of mutual interest. This requires, however, from my perspective, first, for Europe to get more comfortable with geopolitical thinking and geopolitical dynamics. That's something that's very new for many European member states, and nowhere is that more obvious than here in Berlin with this debate about Zeitenwende. This is something that in policymaking circles, in political debates, is relatively new. I mean, of course, if we go back decades or centuries, different story. But in recent years, Germany, for instance, had little perspective of itself as a geopolitical or security player. Not even in the European continent, much less in the Indo-Pacific. So that's a barrier that I think we're going to have to get through, and where we're going to need Europe to get more comfortable with. So linking it back to the question about Europe going through its own redefinition, I think that's an important process, and a process that is going to shape how we approach the Indo-Pacific going forward. And then maybe, and I know we're running out of time, but I'll make a final point, going back to the issue of global gateway versus the Belt and Road Initiative. Interestingly enough, China doesn't see global gateway and the BRI as being in competition. They see them as being two completely different animals doing two entirely different things. So global gateway is perceived as much more ideological and focused on digital aspects, new energy sources, the environment, public-private cooperation, whereas the BRI is trade, investment, finance, development, art, infrastructure. So Beijing perceives themselves as very different. Clearly, we in Europe do not. We see global gateway as Europe's response to the BRI. And for me, the question here is why? Why, if we feel the need in Europe and the EU to come up with an answer to the BRI, something to compete with the BRI, what follows is that we have to acknowledge that China's doing something right. The BRI is working in certain ways, which is why we feel the need to compete. And maybe we need to ask ourselves why and how China's BRI and other initiatives are being successful. And a key aspect here, and it has come up a few times, and of course there's lots of issues with the BRI, that's for a separate panel, but China is relatively good at First of all, at least on paper, attaching fewer strings to its projects. But second, China's perceived as a power across much of the world that listens more and listens better. So instead of coming up with, as Pablo was mentioning, a list of ideas, here are the projects that I think you should be doing, they discuss those, at least in the initial stages. And I think that's a key aspect here. I think Europe needs to be, for sure, more proactive. It has to have a more courageous proposal for the region. It also needs to listen more. And it needs to listen more, which also involves finding or striking the right balance between promoting Europe's own priorities and interests in the region and finding an answer or a response to those of countries in the Indo-Pacific or in Southeast Asia in particular. They don't always overlap. So if Europe wants to be a real, credible, welcome actor and partner for the region, that balance has to be found. And that's something that Europe has not been able to do so far.
Bueno, Helena ya ha hecho la conclusión. Yo creo que...
Well, Helena has done the conclusion. I mean, I'd like to end with the ideas she has mentioned. I believe that the relationship between Europe and Asia is promising, given all of the fields that have been identified here. There has been one that we have not developed because of lack of time, but I believe that it also has an enormous possibilities. What we call in English people-to-people exchanges. You know, the exchange between civil societies. People-to-people exchanges. And we at Casa Asia, we have a relationship with ASED, the Asian Foundation in Europe, who is devoted to this sort of exchanges. Well, we believe this is a field that we should promote more. We find there is a clear connection between European societies and Asian societies. And finally, I'd like to underline that when a center as prestigious as the Pew Research Center asks Asians who is their most reliable and trustworthy partner with whom they would like to set up relationships, they talk to start with Japan, and then secondly, they mention the EU. There is a will on, at least on the civil society's side, there is a will to promote the relationships with the EU. I'm going to stop here. Thank you for being here since 4 o'clock. I think it has been a very interesting afternoon for all of us. And I'd like to ask the institutions who have promoted this seminar to organize more seminars like this one and to invite Casa Asia, because it has been very enriching to me and I hope for all participants. Thank you very much indeed and have a pleasant evening.